Highlander, The Immortal Legacy of the MacLeods by Andries. Below.
Beneath the throne, castles shrouded in mist, ghosts of battles past, legacy carved in granite, legends built to last, burning eyes in the night, beneath Rune's eternal light, shadows answering the call, ancestors whisper low, secrets lost in time.
Prologue. The Legacy of the Source. My name is Amanda, an old friend of Duncan MacLeod. It is my duty to tell you the tale of his life and death, and that of his son Jacob, the new Highlander. The year is 2039. 25 years have passed since Duncan MacLeod's fateful encounter with the Source. In that dark future of 2014, during humanity's descent into chaos, Duncan had made the ultimate choice, choosing love over immortality. His victory against the Guardian granted him something no immortal had achieved before: true mortality and the ability to have a child. Their son, Jacob, was born a year later in 2015, a miracle child, the first natural-born offspring of a former immortal. For 24 years, they lived the life Duncan had only dreamed of, watching his son grow, age, and become a man, even as the world slowly rebuilt itself from the chaos of those dark times. They found peace in their secluded existence. But destiny had a cruel twist in store. The very thing that had made Jacob possible, Duncan's encounter with the Source, had left an unexpected legacy in his son's blood. Now in 2039, with Duncan at 70, his mortal years counted from after the Source, Jacob at 24, and the world still healing from its near collapse, their peaceful life is about to be shattered. Episode 1. Like father, like son. The flames danced in the fireplace as Duncan MacLeod sat alone in his study, his weathered hands tracing the ancient patterns on his katana. The knock at the door was expected. He had felt the presence of another immortal approaching.
"Come in, old friend,"
Duncan called out, his voice carrying the weight of his 70 years. Methos entered, his face grave despite his youthful appearance.
"Duncan, it's about Jacob."
Duncan's heart seized.
"What happened?"
"There was an accident on Ridge Road. His car went off the embankment."
Methos paused, a slight smile playing at his lips.
"But like his father, he has a hard time staying dead."
Duncan closed his eyes, memories flooding back. His own first death, the confusion, the fear.
"Where is he?"
"Outside, confused, scared, but alive."
The door creaked open, and Jacob stepped in, his clothes still bearing the evidence of the crash. Duncan rose, embracing his son tightly.
"Dad, what's happening to me?"
Jacob's voice trembled. Duncan gestured to the chairs by the fire.
"Sit down, son. There's something I need to tell you about your birth, about who you are, who I am."
As they settled, Duncan began his tale.
In 2014, I faced something called the Source. It was during humanity's darkest hour, when the world was falling into chaos. I made a choice that changed everything. I chose love over immortality. It made me mortal, but it also gave me something no immortal had ever had before: the ability to have a child. You were born in 2015, a miracle I never thought possible in my 400 years of life.
400 years?
Jacob whispered.
I was born in the Highlands of Scotland in 1592. I died my first death in 1622, defending my clan. Like you today, I rose again.
Duncan leaned forward.
But my situation is different now. The Source changed me. I'm mortal, stronger than most men my age, but mortal nonetheless. You, however, have inherited something unique. The power of immortality combined with the legacy of the Source.
The car crash. I remember the impact, the darkness, and then...
And then you came back.
Duncan finished.
But with this gift comes great responsibility and danger. There are others like us, some who would take your head to gain your power. I may be mortal now, but I can still teach you what you need to know to survive.
Duncan stood, lifting his katana.
We start training tonight. Every moment counts now, Jacob. You need to learn centuries of survival in as little time as possible.
Jacob rose, his eyes reflecting the firelight with newfound determination.
I'm ready, Dad.
Mythos watched from the shadows, a knowing look in his ancient eyes. The legacy of the MacLeods would continue, but in a way none of them could have foreseen. As Duncan led his son out to begin his training, he caught Mythos's eye. They both knew that somewhere out there, others would have felt Jacob's awakening to immortality. The race to prepare him had begun. Mythos settled into a chair, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of memories.
So, Jacob,
He said, breaking the contemplative silence.
your father wasn't the only one with an interesting immortal origin.
Duncan chuckled, a rare moment of levity crossing his features.
Mythos was over 5,000 years old when we first met, the oldest living immortal.
5,000?
Jacob's eyes widened. Mythos nodded.
I've gone by many names. Death, Adam Pearson, but my original name was lost to time long ago. My first teacher was a warrior from a tribe you've never heard of, in a land that no longer exists on any map.
And you, Dad?
Jacob looked to Duncan.
I was fortunate.
Duncan began.
My first mentor was Connery MacLeod, my kinsman from the same Highland clan. He found me after my first death, when my own clan had cast me out as a demon. Connor taught me everything: how to fight, how to survive, the rules of our kind.
Rules?
Jacob leaned forward.
There's only one rule that truly matters.
Mythos interjected.
There can be only one. In the end, immortals must fight until only a single one remains. The winner takes the power of all those who came before, something called the Quickening.
Duncan's expression darkened.
It's not a game, Jacob. It's survival. Each immortal we meet could be a friend or a potential enemy. We can sense each other. That feeling you had moments before an encounter, that electric tension, that's how we know another immortal is near.
Mythos leaned back, a sardonic smile playing on his lips.
Connor wasn't Duncan's only teacher. Amanda Dario, a master thief and immortal, taught him quite a bit about survival that had nothing to do with sword fighting.
Amanda?
Jacob asked.
A complicated woman.
Duncan said, a fond memory flickering in his eyes.
She taught me that survival isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about cunning, about knowing when to fight and when to walk away.
Your training will be different.
Mythos said seriously.
The world has changed, the game has changed, and you carry something unique, the legacy of the Source.
Jacob looked between the two immortals, sensing the weight of millennia of experience in the room. His journey was just beginning, but he was surrounded by more knowledge than most could imagine in a lifetime. The firelight cast long shadows across the study as Jacob leaned forward, curiosity burning in his eyes.
Tell me about them. The others who taught you.
Duncan smiled, memories dancing across his features.
Each one shaped me into who I am today.
Mythos stretched his legs toward the fire, an amused glint in his ancient eyes.
Go on, MacLeod. Tell him about your illustrious education.
Duncan shot Mythos a look before turning back to his son.
Connor was my first, yes. Found me after my clan cast me out as a demon in 1622. He taught me the basics of our existence, helped me understand what I'd become.
He paused, running a hand along his katana's scabbard.
But there was also Graham Ashe, brilliant swordsman. Taught me advanced fencing in 1750. Would have taught me more if Haresh Clay hadn't taken his head.
Jacob winced at the casual mention of beheading, but Duncan continued.
Mei Ling Shen and Kim Sun introduced me to Eastern martial arts in 1780. Changed my entire perspective on fighting. Then there was Hideo Koto. Taught me the way of the samurai. That's where this came from.
He gestured to his katana. Methos chuckled.
Amanda.
Duncan shook his head, but couldn't hide his smile.
Not exactly a teacher in the traditional sense, but she taught me plenty about survival. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to avoid it altogether.
The thief, right?
Jacob asked, remembering their earlier mention of her.
Among other things.
Duncan nodded.
There was also Giovanni in Italy, 1635. Refined my swordsmanship considerably. Warren Cochrane taught me Highland techniques I'd missed in my early years. Jin Kei helped perfect my martial arts.
You're forgetting one.
Methos interrupted, sitting up straighter. Duncan's expression grew solemn.
Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez. Though I never met him myself, his teachings came down through Connor. He was perhaps the most influential of all, in his own way.
Jacob looked between the two immortals.
How many years of training are we talking about?
Centuries.
Duncan replied.
Each teacher brought something unique. Graham Ashe's precision, Mei Ling's grace, Hideo's discipline, Amanda's cunning. They all became part of who I am.
He leaned forward, catching his son's gaze.
And now it's my turn to pass on everything they taught me.
Methos raised an eyebrow.
Along with a few tricks of your own, I'd imagine.
The world's different now.
Duncan acknowledged.
What worked in the 1700s might not be enough today. But the fundamentals, the discipline, the awareness, the respect for what we are and what we can become, those never change.
Jacob nodded slowly, beginning to understand the weight of the legacy before him.
And now you'll be my teacher.
The first of many, perhaps.
Duncan said.
Every immortal you meet has the potential to teach you something, whether they mean to or not.
He shared a knowing look with Methos.
Some lessons are harder than others.
The ancient immortal raised his glass in agreement.
To teachers,
He said softly.
the ones we remember and the ones we'd rather forget.
To teachers.
Duncan echoed, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of learned wisdom. Jacob watched them both, suddenly aware that his education was about to begin, in earnest. Standing up, Duncan moved to the weapons cabinet mounted on the wall.
But before we begin your training, there's something else you need to understand about our kind, about the game, and about why we fight.
His hand rested on the cabinet's handle as he turned to face his son.
Are you ready to learn the full truth of what it means to be immortal?
Duncan opened the cabinet, revealing a carefully arranged collection of bladed weapons, each one gleaming in the firelight. Jacob stood, drawn forward by their deadly beauty.
Every sword has a story.
Duncan said softly, his fingers trailing over the hilts.
This claymore belonged to Connor, his first sword from the Highlands.
He gestured to a massive Scottish sword with an intricate basket hilt.
Next to it, the rapier I used while studying with Graham Ashe in France.
Methos moved closer, his eyes fixed on a particularly ancient blade.
And that Chinese Dao, Mei Ling's gift, wasn't it?
After our training in 1780,
Duncan confirmed. He pointed to a katana with a black lacquered scabbard.
this was Hideo Koto's final gift to me before his death. The craftsmanship is from the Kamakura period.
Jacob's eyes were drawn to a simple but elegant sword in the center of the display.
And that one?
That
Duncan said, carefully lifting it from its mount.
was my first real sword. Connor gave it to me after I completed my initial training. Not as flashy as some, but it saved my life more times than I can count.
The cabinet also held smaller weapons, a collection of dirks from the Highlands, several tanto blades that paired with the katanas, and what looked like Roman short swords.
The dragon-headed saber.
Methos noted, pointing to an ornate Chinese weapon.
Jin Kei's, unless I'm mistaken.
Good memory.
Duncan nodded.
He used it to teach me the importance of balance. Said a warrior's blade should be an extension of their soul.
Jacob's gaze fell on a peculiar empty space in the cabinet.
Ramirez's katana. Connor inherited it after Ramirez's death at the hands of the Kurgan. It was lost when...
He trailed off, old pain evident in his voice. Methos cleared his throat.
The weapon doesn't make the warrior, Jacob. These are just tools. What matters is the skill and wisdom to use them properly.
He gestured to the collection.
Your father has carried each of these at some point, learned their strengths and limitations. Each blade taught him something different about combat, about survival.
Duncan reached for a classical Spanish rapier, its elaborate hilt catching the firelight.
This one belonged to Ramirez himself, though he never wielded it in battle. Connor found it among his belongings and gave it to me years later.
He turned to Jacob, extending the sword hilt first.
Now it's yours.
Jacob stared at the weapon, understanding the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a sword. It was centuries of history, of survival, of his father's life before him.
The blade chooses as much as the wielder.
Methos added quietly.
You'll know when you find the right one. But for now...
He nodded at the rapier.
You learn with that one. Learn from the best.
Episode 2. The First Lesson. Dawn broke over the MacLeod property, painting the training grounds in shades of gold. Duncan stood watching his son, katana in hand, memories of his own first days of training with Connor MacLeod flooding back. Jacob approached, carrying the sword Duncan had given him the night before, a classical Spanish rapier that had once belonged to Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez.
Before we begin,
Duncan said, his voice carrying across the morning air,
there are rules you must understand, rules that have governed our kind for millennia.
Jacob gripped the sword's hilt, his knuckles white.
Like what happened last night, when I felt Methos before I saw him.
Yes,
Duncan circled his son slowly.
that sensation, we call it the buzz. It's how we recognize our own kind. It's both a warning and a call to battle. But the most important rule is this: we fight one-on-one. No interference, no weapons but swords or axes.
And if we lose?
Jacob asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Duncan stopped, facing his son.
In the end, there can be only one. When an immortal takes another's head, they receive their power, their knowledge, what we call the quickening. It's why some hunt us. But there are sanctuaries.
Sanctuaries?
Holy ground.
Duncan gestured toward the small chapel visible through the trees.
No immortal can fight on holy ground. It's our one absolute law. Break it and...
He shook his head.
The last time that happened, Pompeii was buried in ash.
Jacob's eyes widened.
That was because of immortals.
There's much about history that isn't in books, son.
Duncan raised his katana.
Now your first lesson. Show me how you hold your sword.
Jacob lifted the rapier, mimicking what he'd seen in movies. Duncan shook his head, stepping forward to adjust his son's grip.
The sword is an extension of yourself.
Duncan explained, guiding Jacob's hands.
Not a tool, not a weapon, a part of you. I've carried this katana for centuries. It knows my thoughts, my movements.
Did your teacher tell you that?
Jacob asked, working to correct his stance. A sad smile crossed Duncan's weathered face.
Connor MacLeod, my kinsman, my teacher, my friend. He found me after my first death, just as Methos found you. He taught me everything I needed to survive. But I have had many other teachers in my life also. But I did tell you this last night.
What happened to Connor?
Duncan's eyes darkened.
He sacrificed himself to save me from an ancient enemy. His quickening made me strong enough to face what was coming.
He shook off the memory.
But that's a story for another time. Now we focus on the basics.
For hours they worked on footwork and basic forms. Despite his mortality, Duncan moved with fluid grace, decades of muscle memory making his demonstrations flawless. Jacob watched, learned, stumbled, and rose again. As the sun climbed higher, Methos appeared at the edge of the training ground, observing silently. Duncan noticed how the ancient immortal's hand never strayed far from his own sword. They both knew what was coming.
Again.
Duncan commanded, bringing Jacob's attention back to the lesson.
Remember, every movement must have purpose. In a real fight, hesitation means death.
You mean final death?
Jacob corrected, resuming his stance.
Yes.
Duncan's voice grew serious.
There are immortals who live only for the game, the endless contest between our kind. Some, like Methos, avoid it when they can. Others...
He paused, choosing his words carefully.
Others, like Jupiter, hunt aggressively, taking heads to grow stronger.
Jacob lowered his sword.
Jupiter? Who is Jupiter?
An old enemy,
Methos spoke up, stepping onto the training ground.
one who's been hunting more actively lately. That's partly why I was in the area when I felt your awakening. That is how I found you when you crashed your car.
Duncan nodded grimly.
Which is why we train. You're unique, Jacob. Born of an immortal who chose mortality, awakened to your own immortality. Some will want to take your head simply to see what power your quickening holds.
Then teach me.
Jacob said, raising his sword again.
Teach me everything.
Pride swelled in Duncan's chest as he resumed his fighting stance. His son might have inherited immortality, but that MacLeod determination, that was learned by example. A shadow crossed Duncan's face as another student flickered through his memory. Richie Ryan, young, brave, determined, gone by Duncan's own hand. Methos must have noticed the change in Duncan's expression.
You're thinking about Richie, aren't you?
Jacob lowered his sword, sensing the shift in mood.
Richie. You've mentioned him before, but never...
Duncan's grip tightened on his katana as the memories flooded back. The abandoned subway station, the demon Ahriman taking forms to torment him, making him see enemies where there were none.
Richie Ryan was like a son to me,
he said quietly.
I trained him, just as I'm training you now. He was brave, talented, full of potential.
What happened?
Jacob asked softly. Duncan turned away, his voice thick with emotion.
Ahriman, an ancient evil spirit that appears every 1,000 years. It played with my mind, made me see things that weren't there. I thought I was fighting the demon, but...
He closed his eyes, the pain still fresh after all these years.
It was Richie. I killed him before I realized what I had done.
MacLeod nearly lost himself after that.
Methos added solemnly.
Walked away from everything, everyone, wanted to die himself.
How did you come back from that?
Jacob asked, understanding for the first time the deep wells of pain his father carried. Duncan opened his eyes, looking at his son with a mixture of love and lingering grief.
Joe Dawson, my watcher, my friend, he wouldn't let me give up. Neither would Methos. They helped me understand that honoring Richie's memory meant living, not dying. That the greatest tribute I could pay him was to keep teaching, keep fighting the good fight.
That's why you're so careful with my training.
Jacob realized.
Why you keep emphasizing awareness, control.
Every lesson I teach you,
Duncan said, raising his sword again.
every technique, every principle, they're not just from my teachers. They're also from my mistakes, my losses. Richie taught me the hardest lesson of all, that immortality doesn't make us infallible. We can still be deceived, still make tragic mistakes.
The demon Ahriman
Methos added.
showed us that not all battles are fought with swords. Sometimes the greatest enemies are the ones in our own minds.
Duncan stepped forward, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder.
When I train you, I'm not just teaching you how to fight. I'm teaching you how to live with the weight of immortality, the triumphs and the tragedies. Richie's death nearly destroyed me, but it also taught me the true price of what we are. Every decision we make can have centuries of consequences.
Raising his rapier once more, Jacob nodded solemnly.
Tell me about him, about Richie. I want to know the good memories too.
A small smile touched Duncan's lips as they resumed their fighting stances.
He was fearless, sometimes too much so. Reminded me of myself when I was young. The first time I trained him with a sword.
As they continued their practice, Duncan shared stories of Richie, his courage, his growth, his humor. Each memory was a tribute, each lesson a way of keeping a part of Richie alive. And in Jacob's determined eyes, Duncan saw a chance to pass on, not just the skills, but the wisdom bought at such a terrible price.
There was a time,
Duncan continued, watching Jacob practice his forms.
not long after Richie's death, when I questioned everything. The weight of immortality, the purpose of it all. I was ready to end it.
Methos shifted uncomfortably, remembering those dark days.
Hugh Fitzcairn had other plans.
Jacob paused mid-strike.
Fitzcairn, the one from your stories about the 17th century.
A ghost of a smile crossed Duncan's weathered face.
Fitz, my old friend. He appeared to me when I was at my lowest point. I thought I was ready to die, to let another immortal take my head. The guilt over Richie, the weight of 4 centuries of life. It was crushing me.
But it wasn't really Fitzcairn, was it?
Methos interjected softly.
Liam told me about it later. You were caught between life and death.
Duncan nodded, his eyes distant with memory.
Fitz showed me visions, what the world would have been like if I'd never been born. All the lives I'd touched, the people I'd saved, gone. Joe Dawson, dead in Vietnam. Amanda, losing her head centuries ago. You,
He looked at Methos.
alone, having given up on humanity entirely.
And my mother.
Jacob asked quietly.
She would have died in that chaos when the source appeared.
Duncan replied.
You would never have been born.
He stepped forward, demonstrating another defensive move.
Fitz showed me that immortality isn't a curse, it's a responsibility. Every life we touch, every person we help or teach or love, it creates ripples across time.
Like Grandmother Mary.
Jacob said, remembering the stories of Duncan's mortal mother.
You saved her village.
Yes, and Deborah Campbell, Ian MacLeod, all those who came before you.
Duncan's voice grew stronger.
Fitz made me see that choosing to die wouldn't honor Richie's memory. It would waste it. Every person we lose teaches us something, makes us who we are. Richie taught me about trust and betrayal, about the price of power. But Fitz, he taught me about purpose.
To be or not to be.
Methos quoted softly.
The eternal question.
And what did you choose?
Jacob asked, though he knew the answer. Duncan moved into a fighting stance again.
I chose to live, to keep fighting, to keep teaching, to love again. Because that's what immortality is really about. Not just surviving, but making each day matter. Richie's death nearly broke me, but understanding that my life had meaning, that it made a difference, that saved me.
And now?
Jacob mirrored his father's stance.
Now I have even more reason to live.
Duncan said, his eyes full of pride as he looked at his son.
The game goes on, but it's not just about winning anymore. It's about what we leave behind, the legacy we create. Fitz helped me see that every life, mortal or immortal, creates a tapestry of connections. Pull one thread, and the whole pattern changes.
Duncan said, beginning another sequence.
Immortality isn't just about living forever. It's about what you do with the time you have. Every day, every year, every century. It's a chance to grow stronger, to learn, to become more than you are.
Their blades met in a controlled clash, the ring of steel echoing across the morning air. Jacob was learning quickly, Duncan noted, the way he adjusted his grip, the fluidity of his footwork. The blood of both the Highlands and the Source ran through his veins.
Your opponent
Duncan continued, demonstrating a complex parry.
will try to force you to react rather than act, control the tempo of the fight.
He stepped forward, his katana weaving a pattern Jacob struggled to follow.
Feel the rhythm of the blade. Let it become an extension of your will.
Jacob attempted to mirror the movement, his rapier whistling through the air. The Spanish blade was lighter than Duncan's katana, requiring different techniques, different angles of attack.
Good.
Methos called from the sidelines.
But watch your left side. You drop your guard when you pivot.
Duncan pressed the advantage Methos had pointed out, forcing Jacob to adapt quickly.
Every immortal you face will have their own style, their own favorite tricks. Some will be faster than you, others stronger. The key is to
Adapt or die.
Jacob finished, managing to deflect Duncan's thrust.
Precisely.
Duncan stepped back, lowering his sword.
You're learning to read my movements, anticipate my attacks, but I'm teaching you in a controlled environment, a real fight.
Is chaos.
Methos interjected, walking closer.
No rules, no honor, just survival. The techniques Duncan's teaching you are important, but equally important is learning when to break them.
As they trained, Methos watched from the sidelines, his ancient eyes seeing patterns repeat themselves across centuries. A teacher and student, father and son, the old passing knowledge to the new. But in his gut, he felt a storm coming. Jupiter was out there, and the game was about to become more dangerous than ever. Duncan noticed the shadow crossing his old friend's face.
What is it?
Just remembering.
Methos said quietly.
The last time I saw Jupiter, he'd already taken 12 heads in a month. He's not just playing the game anymore, he's trying to change it. And now, with Jacob's awakening.
He left the thought unfinished. Duncan understood. His son's unique nature, born of an immortal touched by the source, made him a target unlike any other. Jupiter wouldn't be the only one hunting him.
We should move on to defensive techniques.
Duncan said, raising his katana once more.
Learning to survive is more important than learning to kill.
Jacob nodded, settling into his stance again. The weight of Ramirez's rapier felt more natural now, as if the ancient blade was accepting him as its new wielder.
Focus.
Duncan commanded.
Remember what I told you about the quickening. It's not just power, it's knowledge, experience. Every immortal who falls transfers a part of themselves to the victor. That's why some become addicted to it, hunting relentlessly for more power, more knowledge.
Like Jupiter.
Like Jupiter.
Duncan confirmed.
Now, let's work on your footwork. The best defense sometimes is simply not being where your opponent's blade is.
The morning wore on, each lesson building on the last. Duncan could see his son growing more confident with each passing hour, but he also saw the weight of understanding settling in his eyes. The game was more than just survival. It was a responsibility, a test of not just skill, but character.
Screaming how we'll feel the wind, blood on ancient stones, echoes of a warrior's cry, bones beneath the throne, castle shrouded in mist, ghosts of battles past, legacy carved in granite, legends built to last, burning eyes in the night, beneath those eternal light, shadows dance with the flame, Highland scream their name, steel clashing in the dark, warriors rise and fall, echoes in the cold wind, answering the call, ancestors whisper low, secrets lost in time, history.
Highlander, the Immortal Legacy of the MacLeods. Video and voice done with Infinity AI. Research done using Claude AI.